Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I always love hearing from listeners around the world. From bustling cities to quiet countryside towns, all of us connected by our fascination with the unexplained. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps me bring you more of these carefully researched cases, and it tells me you want to keep exploring the darkest corners of history together. Now, let's get comfortable, take a deep breath, relax your shoulders, and dive into tonight's case. Villisca, Iowa, in the summer of 1920 was the embodiment of small-town American life. Population barely over 2,000, everyone knew everyone. White picket fences lined the streets. Children played freely until dusk. Doors were rarely locked. The town sat in the heart of Montgomery County's farmland, surrounded by cornfields that stretched toward every horizon, their green stalks swaying in the warm June breeze. The town centered around Main Street, where the general store, the bank, the post office, and a handful of modest shops served the community. Church was the social center of life in Villisca. Families gathered not just on Sundays, but for Wednesday prayer meetings, choir practice, community suppers, and children's programs. Faith wasn't just a Sunday affair. It was woven into the fabric of daily existence. On Sunday, June 9, 1912, the day began like any other Sabbath in Villisca. The morning sun rose over quiet streets. Families dressed in their Sunday best. Children squirmed into starched collars and polished shoes. Mothers tied ribbons in little girls' hair. Fathers checked pocket watches, making sure they wouldn't be late. The Presbyterian Church, located on the corner of 4th and Shaw Streets, filled with the town's faithful. Wooden pews creaked as families settled in. The organ began its familiar hymns. Reverend Lynn George Amos stood at the pulpit, his voice carrying through the simple sanctuary as he delivered the morning sermon. Among the congregation sat the Moore family. Josiah B. Moore, known to everyone as Joe, sat tall and attentive. At 43 years old, Joe was a successful businessman, well respected throughout the community. Beside him sat his wife, Sarah Montgomery Moore, 39 years old, her kind face framed by dark hair pinned in the fashion of the era. Their 4 children filled the rest of the pew: Herman 11, Catherine 10, Boyd 7, and little Paul 5. The Moore family represented everything Villisca valued: hard work, faith, family, and community involvement. They were not wealthy but comfortable. They were not prominent but respected. They were the kind of family that formed the backbone of small-town America. That Sunday morning, no one in that church could have imagined that within hours, the Moore family would be dead, that their comfortable white house at 508 East 2nd Street would become the scene of unspeakable horror, that their names would be forever linked to one of the most brutal unsolved murders in American history. The morning service concluded with a final hymn. Families filed out into the bright June sunshine, shaking hands with the Reverend, chatting about the week ahead, making plans for afternoon visits and evening activities. The Moore children ran ahead, as children do, their energy barely contained after sitting still for the service. But the day wasn't over. That evening there will be another event at the church, the Children's Day program, an annual celebration where the youngest members of the congregation would perform songs, recitations, and little plays they'd been practicing for weeks. The temperature climbed as the afternoon progressed, typical for Iowa in early June. Families returned home for Sunday dinner, the most important meal of the week. In kitchens across Villisca, mothers prepared roast chicken or beef, mashed potatoes, vegetables from early gardens, fresh bread, and pie. The aroma of home cooking drifted through open windows. At 5 and 8 East 2nd Street, the Moore house buzzed with the particular energy of children excited about the evening program. Catherine and Herman had speaking parts. Little Paul would sing with his Sunday school class. Boyd would stand with the other boys his age, hopefully remembering all the words they'd learned. Sarah Moore moved through her kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing the evening meal while mentally reviewing all the details. Were the children's clothes ready? Had they practiced enough? Would they remember their lines? Joe Moore, a devoted father despite his busy work schedule, likely helped the younger boys with their preparations, adjusting collars, reminding them to speak clearly, to not fidget on stage. The Moore House at 508 East 2nd Street was a modest two-story structure, painted white with dark trim, typical middle-class homes in that era. A small porch fronted the house. A white picket fence enclosed the yard. Inside, the layout was simple but comfortable: a parlor, dining room, and kitchen on the first floor, 4 bedrooms upstairs. It was a home filled with life, with the sounds of children playing, with Sarah's gentle corrections, with Joe's deeper voice reading evening prayers. 2 additional children would join the Moore family that evening. Lena Gertrude Stillinger, age 12, and her younger sister Ina Mae Stillinger, age 8, had been invited by Catherine Moore to stay overnight after the Children's Day program. The Stillinger girls lived just a few blocks away, and sleepovers between friends were common and considered perfectly safe in Villisca's tight-knit community. Lena and Ina's parents, Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, had given permission for their daughters to spend the night with the Moores. It was a treat, a special occasion marking the end of the Children's Day program. The girls were excited, probably packing their nightgowns and talking about staying up late, the way young girls do when they're having a sleepover. No one, not the Stillinger parents, not Sarah and Joe Moore, not a single person in Villisca, suspected that this innocent sleepover invitation would lead to tragedy. That those 2 little girls, Lena and Anna, would never return home. That they would die alongside the Moore family in the dark hours before dawn. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, families across Villisca prepared to return to the Presbyterian Church for the Children's Day program. This was one of the social highlights of the year. Parents dressed their children carefully, knowing grandparents and neighbors would be watching. Children felt the excitement and nerves that come with any performance. The program was scheduled to begin at 8:00 p.m. As twilight settled over the town, families walked toward the church. The air was warm but pleasant. Lightning bugs were just beginning to appear in yards and fields. The sound of children's laughter mixed with adult conversation as the community gathered. Inside the church, the sanctuary had been decorated for the occasion. Someone had arranged flowers. The children assembled in their designated areas, whispering nervously, peeking around doorways at the filling pews. Teachers and organizers moved among them, straightening clothes, offering last-minute encouragement, shushing the more excited children. The Moore family arrived together. Joe and Sarah found seats while their children joined the other performers. Lena and Ina Stillinger were there with Catherine Moore. The 3 girls probably holding hands, sharing their nervousness about performing in front of everyone. At 8 o'clock, Reverend Amma stood to welcome everyone. The program began. For the next hour and a half, the Presbyterian Church filled with the voices of children. Songs that had been practiced for weeks were performed. Recitations were delivered with varying degrees of confidence. Little plays were acted out with endearing enthusiasm and occasional forgotten lines. Parents beamed. Grandparents wiped away tears. The community celebrated its youngest members. Herman Moore performed his part. Catherine Moore delivered her lines. Boyd stood with his group, and little Paul sang with the 5-year-olds, his small voice joining the chorus. No one in that church, watching those children perform, could have known that this would be their last public appearance. That within hours Herman would be dead, Catherine would be dead, Boyd would be dead, little Paul would be dead, all of them murdered while they slept, their young lives ended by an axe-wielding killer who would slip away into history, never to be conclusively identified. The program concluded around 9:30 p.m. Families lingered to congratulate the children, to chat with neighbors, to extend the pleasant evening just a bit longer. The Moore children received compliments on their performances. Lena and Ina Stillinger were reminded to be good guests at the Moore house. Slowly, the church emptied. Families walked home through Villisca's quiet streets. Porch lights glowed. Dogs barked in the distance. The normal sounds of a small town settling in for the night. The Moore family, now 8 people with the addition of Lena and Ina Stillinger, walked the few blocks from the church to their home at 508 East 2nd Street. The children were probably still excited from the program, talking over each other, reliving their performances. Joe and Sarah walked behind, tired but content, ready for everyone to settle down for the night. They had no way of knowing that someone was watching. that their movements were being noted, that their house was being observed, that a killer was preparing to strike. Witnesses later reported seeing the Moore family arrive home between 9:45 and 8:00 p.m. Neighbors saw lights come on inside the house, first the downstairs, then the upstairs as the family prepared for bed. This is where the peaceful part of our story ends, where normalcy gives way to nightmare, where a typical Sunday evening in small-town America transforms into something so horrific that it would shock the entire nation and create a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Before we continue with what happened in those dark early morning hours, we need to understand who these people were. Not just names and ages, but real people with dreams, personalities, relationships, and futures that were stolen from them. 8 individuals who deserved to live full lives, who were loved, who mattered. Let's start with Josiah B. Moore, known to everyone as Joe. At 43 years old, Joe was in the prime of his life. He stood as a pillar of the Villisca community, not flashy or seeking attention, but steadily reliable in the way that builds true respect. And Joe worked as a successful implement dealer, selling farm equipment to the agricultural community that surrounded Villisca. In 1912, this was essential work. Farmers needed plows, harrows, cultivators, and other tools to work their land. Joe understood both the equipment and the farmers who used it. He spoke their language, he understood their needs. He was honest in his dealings, which meant customers returned to him year after year. Those who knew Joe described him as hardworking and community-minded. He served on the local school board, taking seriously the education of Villisca's children. He was active in the Presbyterian Church, not just attending services but contributing to its leadership and activities. He coached the local baseball team, spending summer evenings teaching boys the fundamentals of the game. Joe Moore was the kind of man who shook hands firmly, who kept his word, who paid his bills on time, who helped neighbors when they needed it. In the small-town economy of favors and reputation, Joe's was sterling. But Joe was more than his public persona. At home, he was a devoted father to his 4 boys. In an era when men were often distant from their children, Joe was known to play with his sons, to attend their school events, to take them fishing, to teach them practical skills and moral values. Those who knew the family said Joe had a gentle way with his children. He could be firm when needed, but he wasn't harsh. He wanted his sons to grow up to be good men, honest, hardworking, faithful, kind. He was teaching them by example. Joe had dreams for the future. His business was growing. He was considering expanding into additional product lines. He talked about eventually building a larger house for his growing family. He wanted to see his sons educated, married, successful. He looked forward to grandchildren someday. All of those dreams died with him in the early morning hours of June 10, 1912. Joe Moore never saw his business expand, never saw his sons grow up, never held a grandchild. His future was cut short by violence so sudden and brutal that he likely never woke up, never knew what was happening, never had a chance to protect his family. Sarah Montgomery Moore, age 39, was the heart of the Moore household. In an era when women's lives centered on home and family, Sarah embodied the best of what that meant, not limited by it, but excelling in creating a warm, stable, loving environment for her family. Sarah came from the Montgomery family, well respected in the area. She had been raised with solid values and practical skills. She knew how to stretch a dollar, how to can vegetables for winter, how to sew clothes, how to nurse sick children, how to make a house a home. But Sarah was more than just capable, she was warm. Neighbors remembered her smile, her willingness to help when someone was sick or struggling, her way of making everyone feel welcome. Children loved her. Not just her own boys but neighborhood kids who knew Mrs. Moore would have cookies and kind words. Sarah took her role as a mother seriously. She read to her children. She taught them manners and morals. She made sure they attended Sunday school. She supervised their homework. She bandaged their scraped knees and soothed their fears and celebrated their small triumphs. She and Joe had built a true partnership. In public, they showed the formal propriety expected of married couples in that era. But those close to them saw the genuine affection, the mutual respect, the way they worked together to build a good life for their family. Sarah had her own dreams. She talked about wallpapering the parlor in a new pattern she'd seen. She wanted to join the ladies' auxiliary at church. She hoped to travel someday, maybe to see the ocean. She looked forward to her sons marrying, to becoming a grandmother, to growing old with Joe. None of it happened. Sarah Moore died in her bed, murdered while she slept, never knowing what was happening, never able to scream for help or run for safety or protect her children. Her dreams died with her. Herman Moore, age 11, was the oldest of the Moore children. As the firstborn, Herman carried certain expectations and responsibilities. He was old enough to help his father with small tasks, to set an example for his younger brothers to be counted on. Herman was described as a bright boy, doing well in school. He was responsible enough to be trusted with errands. He helped his mother around the house without too much complaining. He looked after his younger brothers, especially little Paul, with the protective instincts of an older sibling. Like many boys his age, Herman loved baseball. He played whenever he could in vacant lots and farm fields, learning the game his father coached. He dreamed of becoming a really good player someday, maybe even playing for a professional team. Herman was on the cusp of adolescence, that transformation from boy to young man. In another year or two, his voice would deepen. He'd grow taller, stronger. He'd begin thinking about his future career, about what kind of man he wanted to become. He never got that chance. Herman Moore died at 11, still a boy. His potential unrealized, his future erased in a moment of violence he couldn't comprehend. Catherine Moore, age 10, was the only daughter in a house full of boys. This gave her a special place in the family dynamic. She was her mother's helper, learning the skills she'd need as a wife and mother someday. But she was also tough enough to hold her own with 4 brothers. Catherine was remembered as a sweet girl, friendly and outgoing. She did well in school. She had friends like Lena and Ina Stillinger. She participated in church activities. She was excited about performing in the Children's Day program. At 10, Catherine was beginning to develop her own personality and interests. She liked pretty things. Ribbons for her hair, a special dress for church. She enjoyed playing with her friends, sharing secrets and giggles. She helped her mother with younger brothers, showing early nurturing instincts. Catherine had dreams too, the dreams of a 10-year-old girl. Maybe she imagined growing up to be a teacher, or a mother with her own family. Maybe she thought about traveling, about seeing cities beyond Villisca. Maybe she simply wanted to grow up, to become a young lady, to experience all the things life had to offer. She never got to grow up. Catherine Moore died at 10. Still a child, her future stolen, her dreams unfulfilled. Boyd Moore, age 7, was at that wonderful age where the world is full of adventure and possibility. 2nd grade gave way to summer vacation. Endless days of playing outside, exploring, using imagination to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. Boyd was all boy, energetic, curious, sometimes getting into minor trouble the way 7-year-olds do. He probably came home with dirty clothes and scraped knees. He probably resisted bath time and bedtime. He probably asked 1,000 questions about how things worked. But Boyd also had a tender side. He loved his family. He looked up to his older brothers, especially Herman. He was protective of little Paul. He helped his mother when asked, even if he'd rather be playing. Boyd was just beginning to really learn to read well, to do arithmetic, to understand the world beyond his immediate experience. He was developing his own personality, his own interests. At 7, Boyd probably didn't think much about the far future. His dreams were immediate: catching a really big fish, hitting a home run in baseball, maybe getting a dog. Simple dreams, the kind that make childhood precious. None of those dreams came true. Boyd Moore died at 7, his childhood cut short, his potential snuffed out before he could even begin to realize it. Paul Moore, age 5, was the baby of the family at his age. Paul was still very much a little boy, dependent on his parents, adored by his older brothers, the one everyone protected and indulged just a bit. 5 years old is the age of wonder. Everything is new and exciting. The world is magical. Paul probably believed in all the things 5-year-olds believe in, that his father was the strongest man alive, that his mother could fix anything, that his brothers were the best brothers anyone could have. Paul was just learning to really be a person separate from his parents. He was in Sunday school, making little friends, performing in programs like the one that night. He was learning to read his first words, to count, to write his name. Those who knew little Paul described him as a sweet child, affectionate and cheerful. He probably gave enthusiastic hugs. He probably chatted constantly, the way 5-year-olds do, asking questions and sharing observations without filter. Paul Moore had his whole ahead of him. Kindergarten, elementary school, growing up with his brothers, learning to read and write and think, becoming whoever he was meant to become. He never got that life. Paul Moore died at 5, barely begun. His future as unknowable as it was unreachable. Now we come to the Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ina, who were guests in the Moore home that fatal night. Their presence there was pure chance, an innocent sleepover invitation from a friend that led to their deaths. Lena Gertrude Stillinger was 12 years old, the older of the two sisters. At 12, Lena was transitioning from childhood to young womanhood. She was old enough to help care for her younger sister, to be trusted with responsibilities, to begin developing her own identity separate from her family. Lena was described as a responsible girl, mature for her age. She was the kind of older sister who looked after Ina, who made sure her little sister was safe and happy. Friends and family trusted Lena to be sensible, to make good choices. Lena attended school regularly and did well in her studies. She was involved in church activities, Sunday school, choir, programs like the one that evening. She had friends her own age, including Catherine Moore. She was well liked in the community. At 12, Lena was beginning to think about her future. In a few years she'd be finished with school. She'd need to decide what came next, maybe teaching, maybe clerking in a store, maybe marriage eventually. The world was opening up to her, full of possibilities. Lena probably felt excited about the sleepover at the Moore house. It was a treat, a chance to stay up talking with Catherine and Ina, to feel grown up and independent sleeping away from home. She probably promised her parents she'd be good, she'd help Ms. Moore, she'd make sure Ina minded. Lena Stillinger never made it home from that sleepover. At 12, with her whole life before her, she died in a stranger's house, murdered for reasons we still don't understand, her potential unrealized, her dreams unfulfilled. Ina May Stillinger, age 8, was the younger sister, still very much a child. 8 years old is the age of dolls and games, of playing pretend, of believing in fairy tales and happy endings. Ina probably looked up to her older sister Lena with complete trust and admiration. Where Lena went, Ina wanted to go. What Lena did, Ina wanted to do. The sleepover at the Moore house was probably exciting because Lena was going, because her big sister would be there. Those who knew Ina described her as a sweet, cheerful child. She was friendly and outgoing. She loved playing with other children. She participated in Sunday school and church activities with enthusiasm. At 8, Ina May Stillinger was innocent in the truest sense. She saw the good in people, trusted adults to keep her safe, believed that the world was fundamentally a good place. She probably never imagined that anyone would want to hurt her. And his parents, Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, gave permission for their daughter to sleep at the Moore house because they trusted the Moores, because Villisca was safe, because children had sleepovers all the time without anything bad happening. It was a normal, innocent decision that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Ina May Stillinger died at 8, her childhood stolen, her innocence shattered. Her life ended before she could truly begin to live it. 8 people. 8 individuals with names and personalities and dreams and futures. 6 of them children who should have grown up, who should have had the chance to live full lives, to experience all that life offers, both joy and sorrow, triumph and disappointment, love and loss. None of them deserved what happened to them. None of them did anything to warrant such violence. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Victims of a killer whose motivations remain unclear even today. But before we get to the horror of what happened that night, we need to understand that Villisca in 1912 wasn't quite as peaceful as it appeared on the surface. Beneath the veneer of small-town tranquility, there were tensions, conflicts, and secrets that would later become crucial to understanding, or at least attempting to understand, the murders. Joe Moore, for all his respected status in the community, had enemies. In business, as in life, success breeds resentment. Joe's implement dealership was doing well, which meant he was taking business away from competitors. One competitor in particular had reason to dislike Joe Moore. Frank F. Jones was another implement dealer in Villisca, and he was not happy about Joe Moore's success. Jones was a powerful man in town, wealthier than Moore, more politically connected, more influential. But in the implement business, Joe Moore was increasingly winning customers that Jones felt should be his. The tension between Jones and Moore went beyond mere business competition. There were rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, that Jones believed Moore had stolen customers through underhanded means, spreading gossip about Jones's business practices, offering deals that undercut Jones's prices unfairly. Some in town whispered that the animosity between the two men ran even deeper. There were suggestions of personal slights, of social conflicts, of disputes that went beyond dollars and cents into matters of pride and respect. Frank Jones had a son-in-law named William Mansfield, known as Crazy Bill, to some in the community. Mansfield had worked for Jones but had also, at one point, worked for Joe Moore. The circumstances of Mansfield's employment history were murky, but there were suggestions of bad blood, of Mansfield feeling wronged by Moore, of unresolved conflicts. These business and personal tensions simmering beneath Villisca's surface would later lead investigators to look closely at Frank Jones and William Mansfield as potential suspects in the murders. But on that Sunday evening in June 1912, these conflicts were simply part of the normal friction of small-town life, unpleasant but seemingly not dangerous. There were other undercurrents in Villisca that night. The town, like most small American communities in that era, had its share of transients, traveling salesmen, itinerant workers, drifters passing through on the railroad. Most were harmless, just men looking for work or passing through on their way somewhere else. But in the early 20th century, there was growing awareness and fear of a particular type of transient criminal, men who moved from town to town, committing crimes and disappearing before they could be caught. Newspapers carried stories of burglaries, assaults, and even murders committed by these tramps or vagrants. Villisca sat along a railroad line, which meant such men did pass through regularly. Most local people paid them little mind. They were part of the landscape, seen but not really noticed. But their presence meant that Villisca, for all its small town security, was not completely isolated from the wider world and its dangers. On the evening of June 9, 1912, at least one transient was in Villisca staying at the local hotel. His presence would later become a critical piece of the investigation, though whether he had any connection to the murders remains disputed to this day. There were also whispers, always whispers in small towns, about other tensions. Some people, in the years after the murders, suggested there had been sexual impropriety involved, though these claims were never proven and may have been nothing more than attempts to make sense of senseless violence. The Presbyterian Church, central to the community's life, had its own internal dynamics. Reverend Lynn George Amos was relatively new to Villisca, having arrived just a year earlier. Some members of the congregation loved him, others found him cold or distant. There were minor conflicts over church direction, over who had influence, over small matters that loom large in close communities. The Children's Day program that evening had been organized with typical church committee dynamics, some people doing most of the work, others criticizing from the sidelines. Small conflicts over how things should be done. None of it seemed significant at the time, just normal human friction. But after the murders, every small tension, every minor conflict, every unexplained presence would be scrutinized, analyzed, theorized about. People would remember odd behaviors, suspicious glances, unusual comments, all with the hindsight that turns the ordinary into the ominous. On that Sunday evening, though, as the Moore family walked home from church with the Stillinger sisters, none of these undercurrents seemed dangerous. They were simply part of life: business rivalries, social tensions, passing strangers, church politics. Nothing that suggested violence. Nothing that hinted at the horror that was about to unfold. The Moore family arrived home between 9:45 and 1:00 p.m. on Sunday, June 9, 1912. Neighbors noticed lights coming on in the house, then upstairs as the family prepared for bed. This was normal. This was expected. This was the routine of a family settling in after a long day, inside 508 East 2nd Street. Sarah Moore likely directed the children through their bedtime preparations. 8 people needed to wash up, change into nightclothes, and settle into beds. The house had only 4 bedrooms upstairs, which meant careful arrangement was necessary. The layout of the upstairs became crucial to understanding what happened that night. At the top of the stairs, a small hallway connected the 4 bedrooms. The parents' bedroom, Joe and Sarah's room, was at the southwest corner. Herman and Boyd shared a room. Catherine had her own sort of room. The 4th bedroom, where Lena and Ina Stillinger would sleep, was at the northeast corner. Little Paul, at 5 years old, typically slept in his parents' room, in a small bed near theirs. On this night, with guests in the house, the sleeping arrangements followed their normal pattern. The Stillinger girls would share the guest bedroom, probably excited to be having a sleepover, whispering to each other as they changed into their nightgowns. Sarah Moore, ever the attentive mother and hostess, probably checked on everyone, made sure the Stillinger girls had what they needed, reminded her own children to say their prayers, kissed foreheads and smoothed hair and whispered goodnights. Joe Moore likely did a final check of the house before bed, a habit of responsible homeowners in that era. He would have checked that the doors were locked, though in Villisca, many people didn't bother locking their doors at all. He might have checked windows, turned down lamps, ensured everything was secure for the night. Neighbors reported that the house went dark around 15 p.m. The Moore family and their 2 young guests had settled in for the night. Outside, Villisca was quiet. The warm June night was still, stars scattered across the dark Iowa sky. The cornfields beyond town rustled softly in a gentle breeze. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed safe. But someone was waiting, someone was watching. Someone had been preparing for this moment. Exactly when the killer entered the house remains unknown. Based on the evidence later discovered, investigators believe the murderer gained entry sometime after the family had gone to sleep, when the house was dark and still and everyone was unconscious, vulnerable, unaware. The most likely entry point was the back door, which faced an alley and would have been less visible to neighbors than the front entrance. The door showed signs of having been forced or opened, though whether it had been locked at all is uncertain. In 1912 Villisca, many people left doors unlocked, trusting in the safety of their small community. The killer moved through the darkness of the downstairs first. In the kitchen, he found what he needed: an axe. Not his own weapon brought from outside, but a tool that belonged to the Moore family, kept in the house for splitting kindling or other household tasks. The axe had a relatively short handle, making it easier to wield in confined spaces, and a heavy blade capable of delivering devastating blows. Taking the Moore family's own axe, using their tool to murder them, adds a layer of violation to this crime. The killer didn't even bring his own weapon. He used what he found, as if the murders were opportunistic, spontaneous, though the evidence suggests they were anything but. Before going upstairs, the killer did something that reveals calculation and planning. He covered windows. He moved through the downstairs rooms, hanging clothes, towels, and garments over windows and mirrors, blocking any light that might escape, preventing anyone outside from seeing in, creating complete darkness. This wasn't the act of someone in a frenzy. This was methodical. This was someone who wanted privacy, who wanted time, who wanted to ensure he wouldn't be interrupted or discovered. In the kitchen, the killer covered the window with a shirt. In the parlor, clothing was draped over the looking glass and windows. Every reflective surface, every source of potential light, was obscured. The house became a tomb, sealed from the outside world. Then the killer went upstairs, axe in hand, moving quietly, carefully, not wanting to wake anyone. Not yet. The wooden stairs creaked under his weight. They must have. Old houses always make noise. But the family slept on, exhausted from their long day. The children especially tired after the excitement of the Children's Day program. At the top of the stairs the killer paused. 4 bedrooms. 8 people. He had to move efficiently. Had to prevent anyone from waking, from screaming, from escaping, from fighting back. He started with the parents. Joe and Sarah Moore's bedroom was at the southwest corner of the upstairs. Their door was likely closed, or perhaps slightly ajar. Parents of young children often leave doors open to hear if a child needs something in the night. The killer entered their room. The darkness was complete. Those covered windows meant no moonlight, no starlight, nothing. He moved by feel, by the shapes barely visible in the blackness, by the sound of breathing, by whatever dim adjustment his eyes had made to the total absence of light. Joe Moore lay sleeping, probably on his back or side, completely unaware. He never knew what was coming. The axe fell. The medical examiner later determined that Joe Moore had been struck first in the head, a crushing blow that likely killed him instantly or rendered him immediately unconscious. The killer struck multiple times. The exact number is debated, but at least 3 or 4 massive blows to Joe's head. The violence was extraordinary. The blows didn't just kill, they obliterated. They shattered bone. They crushed skulls. They destroyed the very structure of the human head. This wasn't killing for necessity. This was overkill. This was rage. This was something beyond simple murder. Sarah Moore, lying beside her husband, may have stirred at the sound of the first blow. She may have felt Joel's body convulse. She may have had a split second of confused waking, wondering what was happening, reaching toward her husband. If she woke at all, it was only for a heartbeat. The axe turned to her. The same devastating blows fell on Sarah, striking her head with such force that her skull fractured and collapsed. She died beside her husband in the bed they'd shared for years, in the room where they dreamed of growing old together. Little Paul, sleeping in his small bed near his parents, was next. The 5-year-old boy never woke, never cried out, never knew that anything was wrong. The killer struck Paul's small head with the same vicious force used on the adults, as if a sleeping child required the same devastating violence as a grown man. 3 members of the Moore family dead in minutes. In one room, in darkness and silence, the killer moved to the next bedroom. Herman and Boyd shared a room, their beds close together the way brothers' beds often were. At 11 and 7 they slept the deep sleep of childhood, exhausted from their long day. They never heard the killer enter their room, never sensed the danger approaching through the darkness. Herman died first in that room, or perhaps Boyd. The sequence is unclear. What is certain is that both boys were killed in their beds, struck repeatedly with the axe, their small skulls crushed by blows that would have been devastating to an adult, let alone a child. The killer showed no mercy, no hesitation, no recognition of their youth or innocence or helplessness. The same vicious force, the same repeated strikes, the same obliterating violence that destroyed their parents now destroyed the boys. In Catherine's small bedroom, the 10-year-old girl slept alone. Her room was tiny, barely large enough for a bed and a small dresser. She was probably sleeping in her favorite nightgown, her hair braided or pinned for the night, her hands maybe clutching a doll or blanket the way young girls do. Catherine Moore never woke up. She died in her sleep, murdered in her own bed, in her own room, in the house where she'd lived her entire life. The axe fell on her small head with the same terrible force, ending her life in seconds, stealing her future, silencing her forever. 5 members of the Moore family dead. The killer moved to the final bedroom. The guest room at the northeast corner of the upstairs was where Lena and Ina Stillinger slept. The 2 sisters had probably been excited about their sleepover, had probably whispered and giggled before falling asleep, had probably felt safe and happy in the Moore house. 12-year-old Lena and 8-year-old Ina lay in the guest bed, sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that everyone else in the house was already dead, that a killer was approaching their room, that they were about to die far from home, in a stranger's house, without their parents there to protect them. The evidence suggests that something different happened in the Stillinger sisters' room. While all the other victims appeared to have been killed in their sleep, never waking or at least never having time to react, the positioning of the Stillinger girls' bodies suggested possible movement, possible partial consciousness, possible awareness, if only for seconds, of what was happening. Lena's body was found in a defensive position, as if she might have stirred, might have tried to move, might have had a brief moment of terror before the axe fell. Whether she actually woke up or simply shifted in her sleep, we'll never know. But the possibility that Lena Stillinger might have had even a moment of conscious fear before her death makes this already horrible crime even more heartbreaking. Ina, the younger sister, died beside Lena. 8 years old, far from home, her short life ended by violence she couldn't comprehend. The killer struck both girls repeatedly, with the same savage force used on the others. 2 more victims. 2 more children murdered in their beds, 8 people dead. The killing had taken perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, possibly less. In a few horrific minutes, an entire family had been erased, 2 visiting children had been murdered, and a comfortable home had been transformed into a slaughterhouse. But the killer wasn't finished. What happened next reveals something deeply disturbing about the murderer's psychology. After killing 8 people, 6 of them children, with devastating violence, the killer didn't flee immediately. He stayed in the house, he moved through the rooms. He did things that suggest ritual, compulsion, or some unknowable purpose. He covered the faces of the victims, using clothing, bedsheets, towels, whatever was available. The killer carefully draped fabric over the faces of the dead. Not their bodies, specifically their faces. As if he couldn't bear to look at what he'd done. Or as if he was performing some ritual significance we can't understand. This detail, the covered faces, became one of the most discussed aspects of the crime. Criminologists and psychologists have debated its meaning for decades. Does it indicate remorse, shame, respect, religious compulsion, or simply practical considerations, like preventing blood splatter from being visible? The killer also appeared to have spent time in the house after the murders. He washed himself, or at least his hands. In the basement, investigators later found a basin of bloody water, suggesting the killer had cleaned blood from his hands and arms. He had taken the time to wash, to remove evidence from his skin. He may have changed clothing. Some investigators theorized that the killer left bloody garments in the house and took clean clothes, though this was never proven definitively. He definitely left the murder weapon behind. The axe, covered in blood and hair, was found propped against the wall in the guest room where the Stillinger sisters lay dead. The killer didn't take it with him, didn't try to hide it or dispose of it. He simply left it there, leaning casually against the wall as if it were a normal tool temporarily set aside. Before leaving, the killer apparently ate food from the Moore kitchen. Investigators found evidence that someone had consumed a meal. There were dishes with remnants of food, suggesting the killer had actually sat down and eaten after murdering 8 people. This detail seems almost incomprehensible. The casual eating of food while surrounded by the bodies of one's victims suggests a psychology so alien, so detached from normal human emotion, that it defies understanding. The killer also left a piece of bacon on the floor of the parents' bedroom, lying near the bed where Joe and Sarah Moore's bodies lay. Why? What possible significance could this have? Was it accidental? Dropped in the darkness? Was it intentional, some symbolic gesture whose meaning is lost to us? This bizarre detail has never been satisfactorily explained. At some point, probably in the early morning hours, well before dawn, the killer left the house. He exited through the back door the same way he likely entered. He stepped out into the warm June darkness, leaving behind 8 bodies, a house full of horror, and a mystery that would confound investigators for over a century. He walked away through Villisca's quiet streets or through the fields and alleys, and moving unnoticed and unseen, he left no clear footprints, no definitive evidence of his identity, no obvious trail to follow. By the time the sun rose on Monday, June 10, 1912, the killer was gone. But the bodies remained, waiting to be discovered, waiting to transform this quiet Iowa town into the site of one of America's most infamous murders. Monday morning began normally in Villisca. The sun rose over the cornfields. Birds sang. The day promised to be warm and pleasant. People woke to another routine Monday: work, chores, school, in some places still in session. The normal rhythms of small town life. But at 508 East 2nd Street, no one stirred. The house remained dark and silent. The shade stayed drawn. The door stayed closed. Mary Peckham, the Moore's next-door neighbor to the east, was the first person to notice something was wrong. Mary knew the Moore family well. She knew their routines, their habits, their patterns. By 7:00 a.m., Mary expected to see signs of life at the Moore house. Joe Moore was a businessman. He should have been up and about, preparing for his day. Sarah should have been moving around the kitchen, getting breakfast ready, rousing children for the day ahead. But the house remained still, completely still. Mary Peckham felt a growing sense of unease. She looked at the house, waiting for curtains to open, for a door to swing wide, for children to come tumbling out into the morning. Nothing. By 7:30 a.m., Mary's concern had grown into real worry. This wasn't right. The Moore family never slept this late. Even on a summer morning with no school, children would be up, making noise, demanding breakfast. The silence was wrong. Mary called out, trying to wake the family from her yard. No response. She moved closer, calling louder. Still nothing. At 8 a.m., Mary Peckham's worry reached the point of action. She tried the doors, locked. She peered through windows, but the covered windows prevented her from seeing inside clearly. She couldn't see into the house, couldn't see any movement, couldn't hear any sound. Mary knew that Joe Moore's brother, Ross Moore, lived nearby. She also knew that Joe sometimes gave Ross a key to the house for emergencies. She went to find Ross to get him to check on the family, to ease her growing dread that something was seriously wrong. Ross Moore arrived at his brother's house around 8:15 a.m. He had a key to the back door. He'd been concerned by Mary Peckham's report, but probably expected to find something mundane. The family had overslept, or perhaps someone was ill and they'd all been up late, or some simple explanation for the unusual silence. Ross Moore unlocked the back door. He opened it. He stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the stillness. Not just quiet stillness. The quality of air in a house where nothing moves, nothing breathes, nothing lives. Then he noticed the covered windows, clothing hanging over the kitchen window. This was strange, unusual, wrong. Joe. Sarah. Anyone home? His voice echoed through the empty rooms. No response. The silence absorbed his words and gave nothing back. Ross moved through the downstairs. The parlor with its covered mirrors. The dining room appearing normal except for the oppressive quiet. Everything seemed in place, yet everything felt wrong. He climbed the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under his feet, the same creaking the killer must have heard, the same sound that should have alerted the sleeping family but hadn't, because they were already dead or dying. At the top of the stairs, Ross Moore turned toward his brother's bedroom. The door was open or slightly ajar. He stepped inside. What Ross Moore saw in that room would haunt him for the rest of his life. His brother Joe lay in bed, his head a crushed ruin, blood soaking the bedding, the wall behind the bed splattered with gore. Beside Joe, Sarah lay in similar condition, her head destroyed by massive trauma. Little Paul's small body was visible in his bed, the same terrible wounds, the same blood, the same horrific violence. Ross Moore's mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be his brother's family. He stumbled from the room. He may have checked the other bedrooms, sources differ on this detail. He may have seen all 8 bodies, or he may have fled after seeing only the parents' room. In extreme trauma, memory becomes unreliable, fragmented, confused. What is certain is that Ross Moore ran from the house. He ran outside into the morning sunshine, gulping air, his mind reeling. He ran to find help, to raise the alarm, to tell someone, anyone, about the horror inside 508 East 2nd Street. Ross found Ed Selly, a local merchant, and gasped out what he'd found. At first, Selly probably thought Ross was confused, mistaken, perhaps had seen something else and misunderstood. But Ross's terror was real, his horror genuine. Ed Selly went to the house to see for himself. He entered through the back door the way Ross had. He went upstairs. He saw the bodies. Ed Selly confirmed the nightmare. The Moore family was dead, murdered, all of them, and 2 other children besides. Selly ran to call the authorities. In 1912, this meant running to the nearest telephone. Not everyone had phones in their homes. He contacted the town marshal, Hank Horton, and likely others, the mayor, the sheriff, anyone who could help, anyone who could take charge of this unthinkable situation. The news spread through Villisca with terrifying speed. In a small town, information travels faster than any modern technology could manage. Within an hour, it seemed like the entire town knew. The Moore family had been murdered, killed in their beds. 8 people dead, including 6 children. People emerged from their homes drawn toward East 2nd Street. They gathered in yards and on sidewalks, talking in hushed, horrified voices. Some wept. Some stood in stunned silence. Some refused to believe it could be true. The Stillinger parents, Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, learned that their daughters had been murdered. The girls they'd kissed goodbye Sunday evening, the daughters they'd given permission to sleep at the Moore house, were dead, killed in the same attack that wiped out the Moore family. The grief, the guilt, the horror those parents felt defies description. They'd sent their daughters to what should have been a safe, fun sleepover with a trusted family. They'd never imagined danger. They'd never suspected that Sunday evening would be the last time they saw Linner and Inner alive. By mid-morning, 508 East 2nd Street was surrounded by people. Town Marshal Hank Horton tried to keep order, to preserve the scene, to prevent the growing crowd from contaminating evidence. But this was 1912, in a small Iowa town where no one had any experience with a crime like this. Forensic science was in its infancy. Crime scene preservation protocols barely existed. People walked through the house. Neighbors, officials, curiosity seekers, all tramped through rooms, touching things, moving things, destroying evidence that might have helped solve the crime. Blood evidence was smeared. Fingerprints were obscured. Footprints were obliterated. The crime scene, which should have been carefully protected and documented, became hopelessly compromised within hours of discovery. The bodies lay in the house for hours while authorities tried to figure out what to do. Photographers were summoned to document the scene. The resulting photographs are among the most disturbing crime scene images ever taken, showing the victims in their beds, their heads crushed, their faces covered, blood everywhere. Finally, undertakers removed the bodies. 8 bodies carried down the stairs, loaded onto wagons, taken to the funeral home. 8 lives ended, 8 futures erased. 8 souls departed from the world through violence and horror. News of the murder spread beyond Villisca. By Monday afternoon, telegraph wires carried the story across Iowa and beyond. By Tuesday, across America reported the shocking crime. Read the headlines. The nation was horrified. In an era when violent crime was less common than today, when small towns were supposed to be safe, when families were supposed to be protected in their own homes, the Villisca murders represented a fundamental violation of American assumptions about security and safety. If a respected family could be murdered in their beds in a peaceful Iowa town, then nowhere was safe, no one was protected. The American dream of small-town security had been shattered by an axe-wielding killer who came at night and disappeared without a trace. Marshal Hank Horton was Villisca's primary law enforcement officer, but he was completely out of his depth. A town marshal in 1912 dealt with drunks, petty theft, disputes between neighbors. Horton had never investigated a homicide, let alone an octuple murder. Horton did his best. He tried to control access to the house. He tried to identify potential suspects. He tried to preserve evidence, though much had already been destroyed by the crowds that trampled through the crime scene before he could establish control. Within hours, the Montgomery County Sheriff arrived. Sheriff Jackson also had limited experience with serious crimes, but he outranked Horton and took charge of the investigation. The sheriff's arrival didn't substantially improve the investigation's quality. He was nearly as overwhelmed as Horton. By Tuesday, state investigators had been summoned. The Iowa Attorney General's office sent representatives. Private detectives were hired by various interested parties. Within days, the investigation had become a confused mess of competing authorities, conflicting theories, and territorial disputes between different agencies and investigators. The crime scene examination, such as it was, revealed certain facts. All 8 victims had been killed with the same weapon, the Moore family's own axe, found propped against the wall in the guest bedroom. All victims appeared to have been killed in their beds, struck while sleeping. There were no signs of struggle anywhere in the house. The victims' faces had been covered with cloth after death. Windows and mirrors had been covered before the murders, creating total darkness. The killer had apparently washed in the basement and possibly eaten food from the kitchen after the murders. The back door showed signs of forced entry, though this might have been done by first responders rather than the killer. There was no evidence of robbery. Money and valuables remained in the house, untouched. There was no evidence of sexual assault, though some later theories suggested otherwise without credible proof. The killer had left no clear fingerprints, no definitive footprints, no personal items that could be traced. Investigators tried to determine the sequence of the murders, which victim had been killed first, which last. Based on blood evidence and the positions of bodies, they concluded that Joe Moore had probably been the first victim, killed quickly to eliminate the greatest threat. Sarah was likely killed next, then the children in quick succession. The medical examiner who performed the autopsies confirmed that all 8 victims had died from massive head trauma, caused by blows from the axe. The force of the blows had been extraordinary. Skulls were crushed, faces obliterated, bones shattered. The killer had struck each victim multiple times, far more than necessary to kill. This excessive violence, what criminologists call overkill, suggested rage, personal hatred, or some psychological compulsion beyond simple murder. The killer wasn't just killing, he was destroying, obliterating, annihilating his victims. The time of death was estimated to be between midnight and 50:00 a.m. on Monday, June 10th. The exact time was impossible to determine with precision given the forensic limitations of 1912, but the condition of the bodies and other evidence suggested the murders occurred in the early morning hours, probably between 3:00 and 30 a.m. This meant the killer had several hours of darkness to commit the murders and escape before dawn. He had time to move carefully, to wash, to eat, to arrange the bodies and cover their faces, to do whatever unknowable things he did in that house of death, before slipping away into the night. Investigators interviewed everyone they could find who might have seen or heard anything unusual on Sunday night or Monday morning. In a small town like Villisca, witnesses should have been plentiful. Neighbors in close proximity, people walking home from church or other evening activities, anyone who might have noticed something strange. Several witnesses came forward with information that seemed potentially significant, though much of it was contradictory or unreliable. A neighbor reported hearing sounds around midnight, possibly a door closing or footsteps, though she wasn't certain. She hadn't investigated because nighttime sounds weren't unusual, and she had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Another witness claimed to have seen a stranger lurking near the Moore house on Sunday evening, but descriptions were vague and possibly influenced by later knowledge of the murders. Several people reported seeing a man board an early morning train Monday, carrying what might have been a suitcase or bundle. This led to theories that the killer had escaped by rail, but the man was never identified, and it's unclear if he had any connection to the crime. Mary Peckham, the neighbor who discovered the family wasn't stirring Monday morning, provided detailed information about the Moore family's routines and her growing concern when they didn't appear. Her testimony established the timeline of discovery, but provided no information about the murders themselves. Ross Moore, who'd actually discovered the bodies, was interviewed extensively. His testimony was confused and contradictory in places, understandable given the trauma of finding his brother's family murdered. Ross described entering the house, fleeing the bodies, fleeing in horror. He couldn't provide useful information about who might have committed the murders. Reverend Lynn George Amos, who'd presided over the Children's Day program, was interviewed about Sunday evening. He described the program, the families in attendance, the mood of the event. He noted nothing unusual about the Moore family or the Stillinger sisters. He'd seen them leave the church with other families, heading home for the night. Nothing had seemed amiss. Other church members were interviewed. Had anyone acted strangely? Had anyone shown unusual interest in the Moore family? Had anyone left the program early or arrived late? The investigators were grasping for any detail that might provide a lead. Hotel registers were examined. Who had stayed in Villisca Sunday night? Were there any transients, any strangers, any suspicious persons? This led to the identification of several traveling salesmen and other visitors, all of whom were investigated and eventually cleared. Train records were checked. Who had arrived in Villisca in the days before the murder? Who had left Monday morning? This massive undertaking produced lists of names but no clear suspect. Employees at local businesses were interviewed. Had anyone purchased unusual items, large amounts of rope, weapons, anything that might be connected to the crime? Nothing significant emerged. One witness would later become crucial to the investigation, A young man named Samuel Moyer had been walking home late Sunday night and reported seeing a stranger near the Moore house. Moyer's description was vague: a man of medium height and build, wearing dark clothing. This could describe thousands of men. But Moyer was certain he'd seen someone suspicious, someone who didn't belong. The problem with witness testimony in the Villisca case was typical of such investigations. People's memories were influenced by what they later learned about the crime. Details that seemed insignificant Sunday night became sinister in hindsight. Vague impressions solidified into false certainties. Well, meaning witnesses convinced themselves they'd seen things they probably hadn't. The forensic examination of the Villisca crime scene was handicapped from the start by the limitations of 1912 technology and the contamination caused by the crowds that trampled through the house before proper controls were established. Nevertheless, investigators did gather physical evidence that would become crucial to the investigation, even if it ultimately failed to identify the killer. The murder weapon itself provided important information. The axe belonged to Joe Moore. It had been kept in the downstairs of the house, probably in or near the kitchen where it was used for splitting kindling. The killer hadn't brought his own weapon. He'd used what was available, what he found in the house. The axe was examined for fingerprints, but the technology of 1912 fingerprint analysis was primitive compared to modern standards. Moreover, the axe handle had been handled by multiple people after the murders: first responders, investigators, curiosity seekers who'd entered the house before it was properly secured. Any clear prints the killer might have left had been smeared or overlaid with other prints. The blade of the axe was covered in blood, hair, and tissue from the victims. Forensic examination confirmed what was obvious: this was definitely the murder weapon. The distinctive pattern of the blade matched the wounds on all 8 victims. 1 axe, 1 weapon, 8 murders. The short handle of the axe was significant. A full-length axe handle would have been unwieldy in the confined spaces of the bedrooms, particularly for delivering the precise blows needed to strike sleeping victims in their beds. The shorter handle allowed the killer to swing with force while standing in tight quarters, beside beds, in small rooms with low ceilings. Blood evidence was extensive throughout the upstairs. The walls of every bedroom bore blood spatter patterns, arterial impact spatter transfer patterns. In 1912, blood pattern analysis was barely understood as a forensic technique, but investigators did note certain details. The amount of blood was staggering. Beds were soaked through to the mattresses. Walls bore spray patterns extending several feet from the point of impact. Floors were sticky with blood that had dripped and pooled. The pattern suggested the victims had been struck multiple times while lying still. There were no defensive spray patterns, no blood trails suggesting movement or struggle. Each victim appeared to have been killed where they lay, struck repeatedly without resistance. Some blood evidence suggested the killer had stepped in blood while moving between rooms. Faint footprints were detected in the hallway connecting the bedrooms, though they were too smudged and incomplete to provide useful information about shoe size or type. In the parents' bedroom, investigators found the mysterious piece of bacon lying on the floor near the bed. This peculiar detail sparked endless speculation. Had the killer brought it from downstairs? Had he dropped it accidentally? Was it placed deliberately for some symbolic reason? The bacon itself provided no forensic value, but its presence added to the bizarre nature of the crime. The covered mirrors and windows throughout the house were documented and photographed. Every reflective surface, every window on the first floor, had been obscured with clothing, towels, or other fabric. The investigators tried to determine if this had been done before or after the murders, concluding it was likely before. The killer had wanted complete darkness for his work, had wanted to ensure no light escaped the house, had wanted privacy and concealment. In the basement, investigators found the basin of bloody water where the killer had apparently washed his hands and possibly his arms. The water had turned pink, red with diluted blood. Nearby were cloths or rags that appeared to have been used for washing. This suggested premeditation and composure. After killing 8 people, the murderer had calmly washed himself, cleaning blood from his skin. The discovery of food remnants in the kitchen suggested the killer had eaten after the murders. A bowl with remains of what appeared to be a simple meal was found. This detail struck investigators as particularly chilling. The casual eating of food while surrounded by 8 corpses suggested a psychology utterly divorced from normal human empathy. Investigators searched for the clothing the killer must have worn. 8 murders with an axe would produce massive blood spatter. The killer's clothes would have been saturated, yet no bloody garments were found outside the house, no discarded clothing in alleys or fields, no evidence of what the killer had worn. This led to several theories. Perhaps the killer had brought a change of clothes and left his bloody garments in the house, though no such garments were definitively identified. Perhaps he'd worn something that could be easily cleaned or disposed of. Perhaps he'd hidden the clothing somewhere was never found. Or perhaps he'd left the house still wearing bloody clothes, moving through darkness and back alleys where no one would see him. The back door, believed to be the killer's point of entry, was examined closely. There were marks suggesting forced entry, though whether these were made by the killer or by Ross Moore and others who entered the house that morning remained unclear. The door's lock was simple. Most locks in 1912 Alaska were minimal, as people relied more on community trust than physical security. Investigators searched the grounds around the house for footprints, for disturbed soil, for any indication of the killer's approach or departure. The warm, dry weather of early June meant the ground was hard, not conducive to leaving clear prints. Some marks were found in the alley behind the house, but they were too unclear to provide useful information, and they might have been left by anyone, neighbors, delivery people, children playing. The attic was searched, though nothing significant was found there. The basement was thoroughly examined beyond the basin of bloody water. The yard was searched. The barn was checked. Investigators were looking for anything, a hidden weapon, discarded clothing, a clue to the killer's identity. One significant forensic discovery was what wasn't found. There was no evidence of forced entry beyond the back door's ambiguous marks, no broken windows, no jimmied locks elsewhere in the house. This suggested either the back door had been unlocked, or the killer had been skilled at picking the simple lock, or, more disturbingly, the killer had a key. The lack of robbery evidence was significant. Money was found in the house, left untouched. Joe Moore's pocket watch and other valuables remained. Sarah's modest jewelry was undisturbed. This clearly wasn't a burglary gone wrong. The killer had come with a different purpose: murder. The absence of sexual assault evidence, at least as could be determined by 1912 forensic capabilities, was noted but not conclusive. Some later investigators would theorize about sexual motives despite the lack of clear evidence, but at the time, examiners found no definitive proof of sexual assault on any victim. Toxicology was performed on the victims, checking for poison or drugs that might have kept them unconscious during the attacks. Results were negative. No unusual substances were found in the victims' systems. They had simply been sleeping normally when they were killed. The time required to commit the murders was calculated. 8 victims, each struck multiple times, faces covered afterward, mirrors and windows covered beforehand, cleanup in the basement, eating food in the kitchen. Investigators estimated the killer had spent at least an hour in the house, possibly much longer. He hadn't been rushed, he'd taken his time. This suggested confidence, planning, familiarity with the house perhaps, or simply nerves of steel. As the investigation progressed, contradictions and inconsistencies began to emerge that would plague the case for years. The locked door questioned. Some witnesses insisted the back door had been locked when Ross Moore arrived, requiring his key to open it. Others claimed the door was unlocked or only appeared locked because it was stuck. This seemingly minor detail became significant when considering how the killer gained entry. The stranger sightings. Multiple witnesses reported seeing suspicious strangers in Villisca around the time of the murders, but descriptions varied wildly. Some described a tall man, others a short man. Some said he was young, others old. Some placed him near the Moore house, others near the train station. Were these all the same person? Different people? False memories influenced by suggestion? The timeline contradictions. Exactly when had the Moore family gone to bed? When had the lights gone out? Different neighbors gave different times, varying by 15-30 minutes. When had the murders occurred? Estimates ranged from midnight to 50 a.m. These contradictions made it difficult to establish a precise timeline of events. The weapon placement. The axe was found propped against the wall in the Stillinger sisters' bedroom, the last room where victims were killed. But some investigators believe the axe had been moved after the murders, possibly by someone examining the crime scene before proper controls were established. Had the killer left it propped there, or had it been moved by curious visitors? The food evidence. Different accounts describe different food items found in the kitchen. Some mentioned a bowl of cereal or porridge. Others described bread and butter. The piece of bacon upstairs was consistently reported, but its significance remained mysterious. Had the killer eaten multiple items? Had others in the house eat late Sunday night before the murders? The clothing evidence. Some investigators reported finding bloody clothes hidden in the house that might have belonged to the killer. Others insisted no such clothing was found. This contradiction was never resolved. If bloody clothes existed, they disappeared from evidence or were misidentified. The sounds in the night. One neighbor reported hearing a scream or cry around 20 a.m. but had dismissed it at the time as cats or imagination. Another neighbor insisted they'd heard nothing unusual all night. How could brutal murders of 8 people occur without anyone hearing suspicious sounds? The train station sighting. A man matching various descriptions of suspicious persons was reportedly seen boarding the early Monday morning train, but station agents and conductors couldn't confirm this. Some witnesses were certain. Others denied seeing anyone unusual. The lamp evidence. Some reports indicated a lamp had been found burning in the house when the bodies were discovered, suggesting the killer had used it for light. Other reports insisted all lamps were extinguished. This contradiction affected theories about how the killer had navigated the dark house. Perhaps the most significant contradiction involved the suspect pool itself. As the investigation developed, dozens of potential suspects emerged, each with some evidence pointing toward guilt and other evidence suggesting innocence. Investigators couldn't agree on which suspects were most promising, leading to a fragmented investigation that pursued multiple theories simultaneously without ever focusing enough to solve the case. Within days of the murders, the investigation had identified numerous potential suspects. Some were based on solid investigative leads, others were products of small-town gossip, prejudice, and the desperate need to find anyone to blame for the horrific crime. The first suspect to draw serious attention was simply called the transient, or the stranger. A man reported to have been in Villisca on Sunday, and to have departed Monday morning on an early train. Multiple witnesses claimed to have seen this man, though descriptions varied so much that investigators weren't even certain they were all describing the same person. This stranger was variously described as tall or short, young or middle-aged, well-dressed or shabby, carrying a suitcase or carrying nothing, staying at the hotel or camping somewhere outside town, behaving suspiciously or appearing completely normal. The search for this mysterious stranger consumed enormous investigative resources. Train records were examined. Hotel registers were checked. Telegrams were sent to other towns asking about strangers who'd arrived Monday. Descriptions were circulated. Rewards were offered. But the stranger was never found. Or rather, several strangers were found and investigated and cleared, but none matched all the criteria, and none could be definitively placed at the Moore house at the time of the murders. This transient suspect theory appealed to many in Villisca because it meant the killer was an outsider, someone foreign to the community, not one of their own. It was more comfortable to believe a stranger had committed this atrocity than to consider that someone they knew, someone local, might be capable of such horror. A second early suspect emerged from the forensic evidence, someone with knowledge of the Moore house's layout. The killer had moved through the dark house with apparent confidence, had known where to find the axe, had known the layout of bedrooms upstairs. This suggested either reconnaissance before the murders or familiarity with the house. This led investigators to consider people who had legitimate reason to be familiar with the Moore house. Current or former employees, frequent visitors, tradesmen who'd worked on the house, neighbors who'd been inside before, relatives and family friends. Lists were compiled, people were interviewed, Background checks were conducted, but this approach produced too many potential suspects. Dozens of people had been inside the Moore house at various times and could have learned its layout. A third category of suspects emerged from Joe Moore's business relationships. As a successful implement dealer, Joe had competitors, dissatisfied customers, former business partners, and others who might harbor grudges. Investigators looked into business disputes, financial conflicts, and commercial rivalries. This investigation quickly focused on Frank F. Jones, Joe Moore's primary business competitor in Villisca. Jones was a powerful, wealthy man with political connections. He and Joe Moore had been business rivals for years, with tensions between them growing increasingly bitter. Frank Jones had a son-in-law named William Bill Mansfield, who would become one of the primary suspects in the case. Mansfield had worked for both Jones and Moore at different times. He had a reputation for instability, heavy drinking, and violent temper, hence his nickname, Crazy Bill. Among some who knew him, Mansfield's connection to the case was complex. He'd worked for Joe Moore but had been fired or had quit under disputed circumstances. He had knowledge of the Moore house from his employment. He had a documented violent temper. He'd made threatening statements about Moore. According to some witnesses, he'd left Villisca shortly before the murders and returned shortly after. His whereabouts on the night of the murders were not definitively established. But Mansfield also had factors in his favor. He had a partial alibi, though not ironclad. No physical evidence connected him to the crime. His motivation seemed insufficient for such extreme violence. Frank Jones defended him, providing money for legal representation. The Mansfield investigation would drag on for years, with private detectives hired by various parties pursuing leads, gathering evidence, and building theories. Some investigators became convinced of Mansfield's guilt. Others found the evidence insufficient. A fourth category of suspects came from the community itself, people with strange behaviors, dark secrets, or suspicious reactions to the murders. Small-town gossip identified numerous individuals as potentially suspicious. There was a local man with mental health issues who had a fascination with axes, and who had allegedly made disturbing comments about the Moore family. He was investigated but ultimately cleared when his whereabouts on the night of the murders were confirmed. There was a former employee of Joe Moore who had left under bad terms and had been heard making angry comments about his former employer. He became a person of interest but was eventually ruled out when witnesses confirmed his alibi. There was a rival in church leadership who had conflicts with Joe Moore over church matters. This suspect was investigated primarily due to gossip and was cleared when no evidence connected him to the crime. Several convicted criminals with histories of violence were investigated simply because they'd been in the region around the time of the murders. Most were quickly eliminated. A few remained persons of interest longer but were eventually cleared. The investigation also considered the possibility of a deranged drifter or serial killer. In the early 1900s, there were several cases of family annihilations and axe murders in the Midwest. Some investigators theorized that a traveling killer might be responsible for multiple crimes, including Villisca. This theory led to investigations of similar crimes. In Colorado, families had been killed with axes in attacks bearing similarities to Villisca in Kansas. An axe murder had occurred with similar characteristics. In other Iowa towns, there were unsolved violent crimes that might be connected. These investigations produced volumes of paperwork, numerous theories, and intense debate among law enforcement, but no definitive connections were established. Red herrings. The Villisca investigation was plagued by red herrings. False leads that seemed promising but ultimately led nowhere. The bloody shirt. Early in the investigation, a bloody shirt was allegedly found near the train tracks outside Villisca. This seemed like major evidence. Perhaps the killer had discarded it while fleeing. But the blood was later determined to be animal blood, probably from butchering. And the shirt had no connection to the murders. The mysterious phone call. A witness claimed to have overheard a suspicious telephone conversation the day before the murders, with someone discussing the Moore family in ominous terms. Investigators pursued this lead extensively, but the witness's credibility became questionable, and the phone call could never be verified. The Presbyterian church janitor, came under suspicion when someone reported seeing him acting strangely after the murders. He was investigated, questioned, and ultimately cleared when his alibi was confirmed and no evidence linked him to the crime. The jealous neighbor. Rumors circulated about a neighbor who was allegedly jealous of the Moore family's success and standing in the community. This theory was based entirely on gossip and was abandoned when investigators found no supporting evidence. The revenge theory. Someone suggested the murders might be revenge for a wrong Joe Moore had committed years earlier, a business betrayal, a personal slight, some old grudge finally acted upon. Investigators looked into Moore's past, but found nothing suggesting he'd wronged anyone badly enough to inspire such extreme revenge. The cult theory. In the sensationalized atmosphere following the murders, some people theorized about satanic cults or secret societies that might commit ritual murders. This theory had no basis in evidence and was quickly dismissed by serious investigators, though it persisted in local folklore. Each of these red herrings consumed investigative time and resources. Each seemed promising initially but ultimately led nowhere. Each contributed to the growing frustration among investigators who were working hard but making little progress. Building the real suspect. While numerous suspects were investigated and eliminated, one name that would eventually dominate the investigation was Reverend Lynn George Kelly. Though he wouldn't become the primary suspect until later in the investigation, Kelly was a traveling minister who had been in Villister the night of the murders. He'd actually attended the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, the same program the Moore family and Stillinger sisters had attended hours before their deaths. Initially, Kelly wasn't considered suspicious. He was a minister, after all, someone who should be above suspicion. But as the investigation progressed, troubling information about Reverend Kelly began to emerge. Kelly had a history of strange behavior and mental instability. He'd been dismissed from previous ministerial positions due to his erratic conduct. He'd been accused of inappropriate behavior around children, though he'd never been formally charged. Kelly had been seen at the Children's Day program, watching the children perform. Several witnesses remembered him there, remembered his intense focus on the children, particularly the girls. Kelly had left Villisca early Monday morning, departing on the same train that the mysterious stranger was alleged to have boarded. His sudden departure seemed suspicious in retrospect. Kelly had a documented interest in axes and had allegedly made disturbing comments about using axes for various purposes. This wasn't definitive evidence, but it was unsettling given the nature of the murders. Most significantly, Kelly had allegedly confessed to the murders, or at least made statements that could be interpreted as confessions, to multiple people at different times. The nature and credibility of these confessions would become central to the case against him. One confession allegedly occurred in Macedonia, Iowa, where Kelly was heard claiming responsibility for the Villisca murders during what appeared to be a mental breakdown. Witnesses reported that Kelly had ranted about blood, about axes, about children, about judgment and sin, weaving the Villisca murders into his disturbed religious rhetoric. Another confession supposedly occurred to a fellow prisoner when Kelly was briefly jailed on unrelated charges. The prisoner claimed Kelly had admitted to the murders during a late-night conversation in their cell. A third confession was reported by a law enforcement officer who claimed Kelly had admitted guilt during an interrogation, though no written record of this confession was made at the time. The problem with all these confessions was their inconsistency and unreliability. Kelly was known to be mentally unstable. He'd made many bizarre claims over the years. He sometimes spoke in religious metaphors that could be misinterpreted as literal confessions. He might have been confessing to garner attention, or confessing due to mental illness, or not actually confessing at all but simply being misunderstood. Kelly's own behavior added to the mystery. At times he seemed to embrace his role as primary suspect, making cryptic statements and behaving strangely. At other times he vehemently denied any involvement and claimed to be a victim of persecution. Investigators who interviewed Kelly came away with mixed impressions. Some were convinced of his guilt, his strange behavior, his presence in Villisca that night. His alleged confessions all seemed damning. Others felt he was merely mentally ill, saying things he didn't mean. Perhaps even suffering from delusions that made him believe he'd committed crimes he hadn't actually committed. Physical evidence connecting Kelly to the murders was minimal. No bloody clothing belonging to him was found. No witnesses placed him at the Moore house that night. His fingerprints, to the extent they'd be checked with 1912 technology, didn't match any found at the scene, though the fingerprint evidence was so compromised that this proved little. Kelly's alibi was weak but not disproven. He claimed to have been sleeping in a hotel room or possibly in a tent outside town. Accounts varied. No one could confirm his whereabouts during the crucial hours, but neither could anyone definitively place him at the murder scene. As the investigation into Reverend Kelly deepened, other troubling information emerged. Kelly had allegedly been near other unsolved murders in the Midwest, the family killings in Colorado and Kansas that some theorized might be connected to Villisca. Could Kelly be a traveling serial killer, using his ministerial work as cover to move from town to town, committing horrific crimes? This theory had appeal. It explained the seemingly random nature of the Villisca murders, it accounted for Kelly's presence in town that night, and it fit with the emerging understanding that some criminals killed repeatedly, traveling to avoid detection. But the theory also had problems. Kelly was physically slight, unlikely to have the strength to deliver the devastating blows that killed the victims. His mental state seemed too unstable for the calculated planning evident in the murders. The evidence connecting him to other crimes was circumstantial at best. The investigation of Reverend Kelly would eventually lead to his arrest and trial, but that outcome was still months away from the June 1912 discovery of the bodies. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, Kelly was just one suspect among many, not yet the primary focus of investigative efforts. While investigators pursued suspects and examined evidence, Villisca itself was transformed by the murders. The small town that had been a symbol of safe, peaceful American life became a place of fear, suspicion, and tragedy. Neighbors began locking their doors for the first time. People who'd never owned guns purchased firearms for protection. Parents kept children close, no letting them wander freely through town. The easy trust that had characterized community life evaporated, replaced by wariness and doubt. The Moore house at 508 East 2nd Street stood empty, bloodstained, a monument to horror. No one wanted to enter it, no one wanted to clean it, no one wanted to live there. It became a dark attraction, with curious people from Villisca and beyond coming to stare at the White House where 8 people had died. Funerals were held for the victims. Joe and Sarah Moore were buried together with their 4 sons. Lena and Ina Stillinger were buried in their own family plot. The services were enormous, hundreds of people attended, not just from Villisca but from surrounding towns and counties. The grief at those funerals was profound. Parents buried children, an unnatural reversal that violates every instinct. The Stillinger parents buried daughters who died as guests in someone else's home, through no fault of their own, pure victims of terrible chance. The community tried to support the surviving family members, the grandparents, the aunts and uncles, the cousins and extended family left behind. But what comfort could be offered? What words could possibly address such loss? The Moore family business had to be settled. Joe's implement dealership was sold or dissolved. The house eventually was cleaned and prepared for sale. Though who would want to live in such a place? The physical reminders of the family gradually disappeared, but the memory remained. Reverend Lynn George Amos, who'd presided over the Children's Day program, found his own position complicated. Some in the congregation blamed him irrationally. If the program hadn't been held, the children wouldn't have been out late, wouldn't have had the sleepover, might still be alive. This logic was flawed but emotionally understandable. Amos eventually left Villisca, his ministry there made impossible by the tragedy. The investigation itself became a source of tension in the community. As suspects were investigated, as accusations were made, as theories developed, neighbor turned against neighbor. People who'd been friends for years began to wonder if they really knew each other. Trust disintegrated. Some people left Villisca entirely, unable to live in a town associated with such horror, unable to walk past the Moore house, unable to forget what had happened. The population declined slightly in the months and years after the murders. For those who remained, Villisca was forever changed. There was life before the murders, peaceful, innocent, safe. And there was life after, darker, suspicious, fearful. The murders drew a line through the town's history, dividing time into before and after. The media frenzy. The Villisca murders attracted national attention. Newspapers across America covered the story extensively, with headlines screaming about the Iowa Axe murders, the Villisca horror, the massacre of the innocents. Reporters descended on Villisca like locusts. Small-town residents who'd never dealt with media attention suddenly found journalists asking questions, taking photographs, seeking sensational details to feed their readers' appetite for horror. The press coverage was often lurid and inaccurate. Newspapers competed for the most shocking headlines, the most disturbing details, the most sensational theories. Facts were sometimes sacrificed for drama. Speculation was presented as evidence. The line between reporting and entertainment blurred. Some newspapers implied sexual motives despite no evidence. Others suggested satanic rituals or cult involvement. Still others painted pictures of a deranged madman stalking the Midwest, killing families at random. Each theory sold papers regardless of its basis in fact. The media attention brought financial incentives that complicated the investigation. Newspapers offered rewards for information leading to the killer's capture. Private individuals and organizations added to reward funds. Eventually, thousands of dollars were promised to anyone who could solve the case. These rewards encouraged people to come forward with information, some legitimate, much of it false. Witnesses who'd seen nothing suddenly remembered seeing suspicious strangers. People with grudges accused their enemies. Attention seekers made false confessions. Sorting credible information from the flood of false leads became nearly impossible. The media coverage also meant that potential suspects knew they were being investigated. Evidence couldn't be gathered secretly. Witnesses couldn't be interviewed without newspapers reporting it. This made the investigation more difficult, as suspects could prepare alibis, destroy evidence, or flee before investigators could build a case. The sensational coverage turned Villisca into a tourist destination of sorts. People traveled to see the murder house, to walk through the town where such horror had occurred, to experience the morbid thrill of proximity to famous violence. This yearlish tourism disturbed local residents but proved difficult to prevent. Magazine articles, true crime books, and even early film treatments of the murders appeared in the months and years after the crime. Each retelling added layers of speculation and dramatization to the basic facts. The actual events became obscured by the mythology that grew around them. By late 1912, 6 months after the murders, the investigation had become hopelessly fragmented. Multiple agencies were pursuing different suspects based on conflicting theories. The Montgomery County Sheriff's Office was focused on William Mansfield and the business rivalry angle, convinced that Joe Moore's commercial success had motivated revenge. The Iowa State Police were pursuing the transient theory, believing a traveling criminal had committed the murders and fled on the early morning train. Private detectives hired by the Stillinger family were investigating Reverend Kelly, increasingly convinced that the unstable minister was responsible. Another set of private detectives, hired by Frank Jones, were pursuing alternative suspects and trying to discredit the Mansfield investigation. Local law enforcement in Villisca, led by Marshal Horton, was overwhelmed and had largely stepped aside, leaving the case to state and private investigators. These different investigative threads rarely coordinated. Evidence wasn't shared efficiently. Suspects investigated by one agency weren't always communicated to others. Theories were developed in isolation, leading to contradictory conclusions. The fragmentation meant that no single investigative approach received the focused attention necessary to either prove or disprove its merits. Leads were pursued half-heartedly. Suspects were investigated incompletely, and evidence was analyzed inconsistently. Moreover, the legal landscape in 9/12 America made cross-jurisdictional investigation difficult. If a suspect fled to another state, pursuing him required cooperation from that state's law enforcement, which wasn't always forthcoming. Extradition was complicated. Communication was slow, relying on mail and telegraph rather than modern instant communication. The investigation was also hampered by the limitations of forensic science. There was no DNA analysis, no digital forensics, no computer databases of criminal records. Fingerprinting was still relatively new and not universally accepted in courts. Blood typing existed but was primitive. Ballistics analysis was in its infancy. Not that it mattered in an axe murder case. Investigators worked with the tools available to them: witness testimony, physical evidence examined by eye and simple microscopy, deductive reasoning. These tools had solved many crimes, but the Villisca case proved resistant to the methods of the day. By the end of 1912, the investigation had reached an impasse. Multiple suspects remained under investigation, but none could be definitively linked to the crime. Evidence was suggestive but not conclusive. Witnesses were unreliable. Theories were plausible but unproven. The Villisca murders were becoming a cold case, though that term didn't exist yet. The investigation continued, but momentum had been lost. The trail was growing cold. The killer, whoever he was, had apparently escaped justice. Just when the investigation seemed to be stalling, a development in 1914, 2 years after the murders, would dramatically refocus attention on Reverend Lynn George Kelly and bring the case back to national prominence. This twist came not from new physical evidence, but from Kelly's own increasingly erratic behavior and his apparent inability to stop talking about the Villisca murders. Kelly had continued his itinerant ministry after leaving Villisca, traveling through Iowa and neighboring states, preaching at various churches and religious gatherings. But wherever he went, the Villisca murders seemed to follow him, not because investigators were tracking him, but because Kelly himself kept bringing up the subject. In late 1913, Kelly began making statements to various people that seemed to implicate him in the murders. These weren't clear confessions in the legal sense, but rather disturbing comments woven into his religious rhetoric. References to blood and judgment, cryptic statements about knowing secrets of that terrible night in Villisca. One witness, a fellow minister named Reverend Govert, reported a conversation with Kelly in which the unstable preacher had said something deeply unsettling. "I have a confession to make. I committed the Villisca murders. God told me to do it to cleanse the world of sinners." But then, in the same conversation, Kelly seemed to recant or reframe the statement, suggesting he'd been speaking metaphorically about spiritual matters, not literal murders. Govert didn't know what to make of it. Was Kelly confessing to actual murder? Or was he simply mentally disturbed, conflating religious symbolism with real events? Similar reports came from other places Kelly had visited. A boarding house owner in Council Bluffs, Iowa, reported that Kelly had ranted about axes and blood during a nighttime episode that resembled a mental breakdown. A church deacon in Missouri described Kelly's that seemed to obsessively reference the Villisca case, weaving details of the murders into a bizarre theological framework about divine judgment. These reports reached investigators in late 1913 and early 1914. The private detectives hired by the Stillinger family, who had been focusing on Kelly as a suspect, saw these new statements as confirmation of their suspicions. They intensified their investigation into the minister's background, his movements, and his mental state. What they discovered was deeply troubling. Kelly had a documented history of mental illness, including periods of what might today be diagnosed as psychotic breaks. He'd been institutionalized briefly several years before the Villisca murders for what records described as religious mania. Kelly had an obsessive interest in axes. Multiple witnesses reported that he frequently discussed axes in his sermons and conversations, referring to them as instruments of God's judgment. He'd allegedly carried an axe with him during some of his travels, though the reason for this was unclear. Kelly had been near the locations of several other unsolved murders in the Midwest around the same time period as Villisca. While this could be coincidence, Kelly traveled extensively as an itinerant minister. The proximity was suspicious. Most damning, Kelly had no credible alibi for the night of the murders. His accounts of his whereabouts that night were vague and contradictory. He claimed to have been sleeping in a tent outside Villisca, or in a hotel room, or camping elsewhere. His story changed depending on when he was asked. In June 1914, exactly 2 years after the murders, Reverend Lynn George Kelly was arrested and charged with the murders of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters. The arrest made national headlines. After 2 years of investigation, multiple suspects, and growing public frustration with the unsolved case, authorities finally had someone in custody. Kelly was transported to Villisca to face charges. But Kelly's arrest revealed a major problem that would plague the prosecution. Kelly was clearly mentally ill. His behavior in custody was erratic and bizarre. He alternated between claiming innocence and making cryptic statements that could be interpreted as confessions. He spoke in religious metaphors, mixed biblical verses with references to the murders, and seemed unable to distinguish between reality and his own disturbed fantasies. A psychiatric evaluation was ordered. The doctors who examined Kelly found him to be suffering from what they termed religious paranoia and moral insanity. In modern terms, Kelly might be diagnosed with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder with psychotic features, or another serious mental illness. The question became, even if Kelly was guilty, was he mentally competent to stand trial? The legal proceedings became complicated. Kelly's defense attorneys, paid for by supporters who believed him innocent or insane, argued that their client was not mentally fit to participate in his own defense. The prosecution argued that Kelly was sane enough to be tried, and that his apparent mental illness might be an act designed to avoid justice. While the Kelly case was developing, another twist emerged that complicated the investigation even further. New evidence suggested that William Mansfield, Frank Jones's son-in-law, might be the actual killer, and that the focus on Kelly was a distraction from the real culprit. A private detective named James Wilkerson, hired by parties who believed in Mansfield's guilt, claimed to have uncovered damning new evidence against Mansfield. A witness had come forward claiming to have seen Mansfield in Villisca on the night of the murders, despite Mansfield's alibi placing him elsewhere. Another witness reported that Mansfield had made threatening statements about Joe Moore in the weeks before the murders, saying Moore would get what was coming to him. A third witness claimed Mansfield had inquired about train schedules leaving Villisca in the early morning hours, as if planning an escape route. Most significantly, Wilkerson claimed to have found a witness who'd seen Mansfield washing blood from his hands at a water pump outside Villisca on the morning of June 10, 1912. These revelations created chaos in the investigation. Now there were two primary suspects, Kelly and Mansfield, each with evidence suggesting guilt and evidence suggesting innocence. The investigation had split into two opposing camps, each convinced their suspect was the real killer. Frank Jones, Mansfield's father-in-law and one of the most powerful men in Villisca, threw his considerable wealth and influence into defending Mansfield and attacking the credibility of witnesses against him. Jones hired his own detectives, his own lawyers, and used his political connections to influence the investigation. Some people believed Jones was simply protecting his son-in-law. Others suspected something darker, that Jones himself had orchestrated the murders, using Mansfield as the actual killer, motivated by his hatred of business rival Joe Moore. This theory held that Jones, unable to accept Moore's business success, had convinced or coerced Mansfield to murder the Moore family. Jones's motive would be revenge and elimination of commercial competition. Mansfield's motive would be loyalty to Jones, possibly combined with his own grudge against Moore from his employment history. The Jones conspiracy theory gained traction in some circles. It explained several puzzling aspects of the case: why Mansfield's alibi seemed weak but couldn't be definitively broken. Perhaps Jones had helped arrange it. Why the investigation into Mansfield faced unusual obstacles and resistance. Perhaps Jones was using his influence to protect him. Why the murders seemed both planned and rage-filled. Perhaps Mansfield was following orders but added his own violent excess. Why no robbery occurred. Business revenge, not theft, was the motive. However, the Jones conspiracy theory also had significant problems. It required believing that a respected businessman would order the murder of 6 children along with his business rival. An almost incomprehensible level of evil. It required believing that Mansfield would commit such horrific murders on someone else's orders. It didn't explain the covered faces, the eating of food, the peculiar details that suggested psychological compulsion rather than hired killing. No direct evidence linked Jones to planning or ordering the murders. As 1914 progressed, Villisca and the surrounding region found themselves caught between competing theories of the crime. The Kelly theory, a mentally disturbed traveling minister, obsessed with axes and divine judgment, had committed the murders in a psychotic break, possibly believing he was carrying out God's will. The Mansfield theory, a violent, unstable man with grudges against Joe Moore, had committed the murders either on his own initiative or at the behest of Frank Jones. The stranger theory, an unknown transient, possibly a serial killer, had committed the murders and escaped, never to be identified. Each theory had passionate advocates. Each had evidence supporting it. Each had problems and contradictions. The truth remained elusive. In September 1917, more than 5 years after the murders, Reverend Lynn George Kelly finally stood trial for the murder of Lena Stillinger. The prosecution chose to try him for one murder rather than all 8, believing that a conviction in one would establish guilt for all. While trying all 8 simultaneously would complicate the proceedings, the trial was held in Villisca, though finding an impartial jury proved nearly impossible. Everyone in the area knew about the murders, had opinions about the case, and had often already decided Kelly's guilt or innocence based on newspaper coverage and community gossip. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Kelly's alleged confessions and his suspicious behavior. Multiple witnesses testified that Kelly had confessed to the murders at various times. Though the confessions were often couched in religious language and could be interpreted in different ways, Kelly's presence at the Children's Day program was established. He'd been in Villisca that night, had seen the victims hours before their deaths. Kelly's departure from Villisca on the early morning train was presented as evidence of flight from the crime scene. Kelly's lack of a credible alibi was emphasized. He couldn't definitively prove where he'd been during the crucial hours. Expert witnesses testified about Kelly's mental state, with prosecution experts arguing that while Kelly was mentally ill, he was not insane in the legal sense and knew right from wrong. The axe obsession was documented through witnesses who described Kelly's frequent references to axes in his sermons and conversations. But the prosecution's case had significant weaknesses. No physical evidence connected Kelly to the murders. No bloody clothing was found. No witnesses placed him at the Moore house that night. No forensic evidence linked him to the crime scene. Kelly's confessions were ambiguous and could be interpreted as the ravings of a mentally ill man rather than admissions of actual guilt. Kelly was physically slight. Some witnesses questioned whether he'd have the strength to deliver the devastating blows that killed the victims. The prosecution couldn't establish a clear motive. Why would Kelly murder people he didn't know? What would drive him to kill children? The defense presented a vigorous case for Kennis. Character witnesses testified that Kelly, despite his mental illness, was fundamentally gentle and non-violent. He'd never been known to harm anyone. Defense psychiatrists testified that Kelly suffered from severe mental illness that manifested in false confessions and delusional beliefs. He might genuinely believe he'd committed the murders without actually having done so. Alibi witnesses, admittedly weak, testified that Kelly had been elsewhere during the murders, though their testimony was vague and contradictory. The defense argued that Kelly had become a scapegoat, targeted because of his mental illness and strange behavior, while the real killer remained free. The defense presented alternative suspects, particularly William Mansfield, suggesting that the prosecution was pursuing the wrong man. The trial lasted weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses. The prosecution presented their case methodically, building a circumstantial argument for Kelly's guilt. The defense fought every point, raising reasonable doubt about each piece of evidence. The jury deliberated for hours. The town of Villisca held its breath, waiting for a verdict that would finally bring closure to the 5-year-old case. On September 26, 1917, the jury returned with their verdict not guilty. Reverend Lynn George Kelly was acquitted of the murder of Lena Stillinger. The prosecution's case had not proven good beyond reasonable doubt. The circumstantial evidence, the ambiguous confessions, the suspicious behavior, none of it was enough to convict. The reaction to the verdict was mixed. Some people believed justice had been served. Kelly was innocent, a mentally ill man who'd been wrongly accused. Others were outraged. A guilty man had walked free on a technicality, and the real killer or 8 people would never face justice. The prosecution considered trying Kelly for the murders of the other victims, but the acquittal in the Stillinger case effectively ended that possibility. If they couldn't convict Kelly with all their evidence in one case, they wouldn't succeed in others. Reverend Lynn George Kelly walked free. He resumed his itinerant ministry, though his life was forever marked by the Villisca case. He continued to make strange statements about the murders, continued to exhibit signs of mental illness, continued to be followed by suspicion wherever he went. Kelly died in 1933, never having been retried for the Villisca murders, never having definitively confessed or been cleared. To his last days, the question remained, was Lynn George Kelly the Villisca killer? Or was he simply a mentally ill man caught up in a case he had nothing to do with? While Kelly was being tried and acquitted, the investigation into William Mansfield continued separately. Mansfield had never been formally charged with the murders, but suspicion continued to follow him, fueled by Frank Jones's enemies and by private detectives who remained convinced of his guilt. In 1916, a grand jury had been convened to consider evidence against Mansfield. Witnesses testified about his threats against Joe Moore, about his violent temper, about seeing him in Villisca the night of the murders despite his alibi. But the grand jury had declined to indict Mansfield. The evidence, while suspicious, wasn't strong enough to charge him. Witnesses were contradictory, physical evidence was absent. Mansfield's defenders, particularly Frank Jones, presented alibis and character witnesses that created reasonable doubt. The decision not to indict Mansfield disappointed those who believed in his guilt. They saw it as evidence of Frank Jones's influence, of corruption in the system, of a wealthy, powerful man protecting his family at the expense of justice. But the legal standard for indictment had not been met. Without stronger evidence, prosecutors couldn't move forward. Mansfield, like Kelly, remained free, suspected but never convicted. Private detectives continued investigating Mansfield for years after the grand jury declined to indict. They interviewed new witnesses, gathered more circumstantial evidence, built elaborate theories about how Mansfield had committed the murders, and how Jones had helped cover it up. But private detective work, no matter how thorough, couldn't substitute for official legal proceedings. Without law enforcement support and without physical evidence, the case against Mansfield stalled. Mansfield died in 1930 like Kelly, never having been formally charged with the Villisca murders. His guilt or innocence went with him to the grave. Beyond Kelly and Mansfield, numerous other suspects were investigated over the years, though none as thoroughly or with as much evidence. Henry Lee Moore was a convicted killer who had committed axe murders of 2 families in Missouri in 1912, just weeks after the Villisca killings. The similarities were striking: entire families killed with an axe while sleeping, faces covered, murders committed at night. Henry Moore was investigated as a possible Villisca suspect, but the timeline was problematic. Could he have committed the Villisca murders, escaped, and committed the Missouri murders just weeks later? It was possible, but difficult to prove. Henry Moore never confessed to Villisca, and no evidence linked him to Iowa. Nevertheless, the theory that a serial killer had committed multiple family inhalations in the Midwest in 1912 persisted. Some researchers identified as many as 8 similar axe murders of families during the 1911-1912 period, all within a few hundred miles of each other. Could one killer be responsible for all of them? The man from the train theory, named after the idea that the killer traveled by rail between murders, suggested exactly that. This theory proposed an unknown transient who rode freight trains, selected victims in small towns near railroad lines, committed horrific murders, and disappeared before he could be caught. The man from the train theory explained certain aspects of the Villisca case. Why the killer was never caught. He left the area immediately after the murders. Why no clear motive existed. The killer was a psychopath who murdered for psychological gratification, not for robbery or revenge. Why the crime seemed both planned and psychologically disturbed. Serial killers often exhibit both calculation and compulsion. Why similar murders occurred across the region. One killer committing multiple crimes. But the theory also had problems. It couldn't identify the specific killer. The man from the train remained a theoretical construct. not a named individual. Some of the similar murders had significant differences from Villisca, suggesting they might not be connected. No physical evidence linked any of the Midwest axe murders to each other. Another suspect investigated years after the murders was Andy Sawyer, a local man with a reputation for violence and mental instability. Sawyer had been investigated early in the case but had been cleared when witnesses confirmed his alibi. However, in the 1920s, new witnesses came forward claiming that Sawyer's alibi was false, that he'd actually been near the Moore house the night of the murders, and that he'd made suspicious statements about the case. Sawyer was reinvestigated, but by this time memories had faded, evidence was long gone, and prosecutors had no interest in pursuing yet another weak case. Sawyer was never charged. Sam Moyer, who'd reported seeing a suspicious stranger near the Moore house the night of the murders, himself came under suspicion at various times. Had he invented the stranger to deflect suspicion from himself? Was he the killer hiding in plain sight by pretending to be a witness? Moyer was investigated but cleared when no evidence supported the theory. His sighting of a stranger, whether accurate or imagined, remained part of the case record. Even Ross Moore, who discovered the bodies, was briefly considered a suspect by some investigators who thought his horror at finding his brother's family might have been guilt, rather than grief. But Ross had a solid alibi for the night of the murders, and no evidence suggested he was anything but an innocent victim of circumstances who'd made the terrible discovery. Over the decades, various other individuals were suggested as suspects, investigated, and cleared or simply forgotten. Traveling salesmen who'd been in Villisca that week, local men with documented mental illness, former employees of Joe Moore with grievances, neighbors with strange behaviors, convicted criminals who happened to be in the region. Each suspect generated investigation, consumed resources, produced theories, and led nowhere. The Villisca murders remained unsolved. The investigation goes cold. By the 1920s, investigation into the Villisca murders had effectively ended. Kelly had been tried and acquitted. Mansfield had been investigated but never charged. Other suspects had been pursued without result. The primary investigators had moved on to other cases or retired. The witnesses were aging, their memories fading, some dying and taking their knowledge with them. The physical evidence had been compromised or lost. The crime scene had been cleaned and the house sold. The Villisca murders transitioned from an active case to a cold case to historical mystery. Law enforcement files were closed and archived. The case became the subject of books, articles, and eventually academic research, but official investigative work ceased. The town of Villisca slowly recovered from its trauma, though the murders remained a defining event in the community's history. The Moore house at 508 East 2nd Street changed hands several times, with each owner struggling with the property's dark history. Some tried to rent it, others left it empty. Everyone who owned it had to decide what to do with a house where 8 people had been brutally murdered. The survivors, those who'd lost family members in the murders, dealt with their grief privately. The extended Moore family tried to rebuild their lives. The Stillinger parents mourned their daughters for the rest of their lives, forever wondering what if they hadn't given permission for that sleepover. What if the girls had stayed home that night? What if the wounds left by the murders never fully healed? Villisca carried the scar of that June night in 1912 through decades, through generations, becoming known primarily for its association with tragedy and horror. In the decades since the murders, various researchers, writers, and amateur investigators have attempted to solve the case using modern methods and fresh perspectives. In the 1970s, a researcher named Roy Marshall conducted extensive interviews with surviving witnesses and family members, gathering oral histories before that generation passed away. Marshall's work preserved details that might otherwise have been lost but didn't solve the case. In the 1990s, author Roy Cooper wrote a comprehensive book about the murders, examining all the major suspects and theories. Cooper's work brought renewed attention to the case but reached no definitive conclusion. In 2017, authors Bill James and Rachel McCarthy James published The Man from the Train, proposing that a serial killer was responsible for Villisca and numerous other family murders. Their theory is well researched but remains unproven. Various television documentaries have examined the case, using modern forensic techniques to analyze old evidence, though the compromised and incomplete nature of that evidence limits what can be learned. Some investigators have attempted to use modern genealogical DNA techniques, the same methods that solved the Golden State Killer case, but the Villisca case predates the collection of biological samples that could be tested with modern technology. The Moore house itself has become a peculiar landmark. In 1994, it was purchased and restored to its 1912 appearance, turned into a museum and overnight lodging where curious visitors can tour the crime scene and even sleep in the rooms where the murders occurred. This dark tourism is controversial. Some see it as educational, others as exploitative. Paranormal investigators have claimed the house is haunted, reporting strange sounds, apparitions, and supernatural phenomena. These claims range from the possibly genuine experiences of psychological suggestion in a traumatic location to obvious fabrications for attention. The paranormal angle adds another layer to the Villisca story, though it contributes nothing to solving the actual crime. Despite all this modern attention, the Villisca murders remain unsolved. Every investigator who examines the case has their favored theory. Some remain convinced Kelly was guilty, arguing that his mental illness doesn't negate his guilt and that his confessions, however ambiguous, reflected actual knowledge of the crime. Others believe Mansfield committed the murders, possibly at Frank Jones's behest, and that wealth and influence prevented justice. Still others subscribe to the serial killer theory, believing an unknown traveling killer committed Villisca and other similar crimes. A few researchers believe the case is unsolvable, that too much time has passed, too much evidence has been lost, and too many potential suspects have died without ever being definitively investigated. More than a century after the murders, certain questions remain unanswered and likely will remain so forever. Who killed the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters? Was it Reverend Kelly William Mansfield, an unknown transient, Henry Lee Moore, or someone else entirely? What was the motive? Revenge, psychosis, sexual compulsion, serial killing, hired murder, or something else? Why were the faces covered? What did this ritual mean to the killer? How did the killer gain entry to the house? Was the door unlocked? Was it forced? Did the killer have a key? Why did the killer stay in the house after the murders? What possessed him to wash, to eat, to linger at the scene? Was Villisca an isolated crime or part of the series? Are the similar axe murders connected or coincidental? Could the case have been solved if the investigation had been handled differently in 1912? These questions haunt anyone who studies the case. The lack of answers is frustrating, unsatisfying, a wound that won't heal because it can't close. Over the decades since the murders, criminologists and psychologists have attempted to understand what kind of person could commit such horrific acts. The evidence reveals a complex and deeply disturbing psychological profile. The killer demonstrated careful planning. He covered windows and mirrors before the murders, creating total darkness and privacy. This wasn't spontaneous rage, it was calculated, methodical preparation. Yet the extreme violence, crushing skulls with repeated blows far beyond what was needed to kill, suggests intense fury or severe mental illness. The covering of victims' faces after death remains one of the most psychologically revealing details. This could indicate remorse, religious ritual, superstition, or a need to demonize the victims. The killer couldn't look at what he'd done, or perhaps believed covering faces held spiritual significance. His decision to remain in the house after the murders, washing himself, eating food, lingering for hours, reveals either psychopathy or severe detachment from reality. A normal person would flee immediately. This killer was comfortable surrounded by 8 corpses, calm enough to perform routine tasks in a house of death. The profile suggests a male aged 25-45, intelligent and organized, suffering from serious mental illness, possibly religious mania, psychosis, or psychopathy. He likely had some connection to the victims or knowledge of the house layout. He was physically unremarkable, able to blend into the community. This profile fits multiple suspects. Reverend Kelly with his documented mental illness and religious obsessions. William Mansfield with his violent temper and connection to Joe Moore. An unknown serial killer traveling by train. Each possibility has evidence supporting it, none conclusive. The Moore family returned home around 9:45 p.m., tired and happy after the Children's Day program. Sarah herded the children toward bedtime. Catherine and the Stillinger sisters whispered and giggled in their room. Herman and Boyd settled into their beds. Little Paul was tucked in by his mother. Joe completed his final checks of the house, feeling satisfied with a good day. By 10:15 p.m., 8 people slept peacefully, expecting to wake to a normal Monday morning. The killer approached sometime after midnight. He entered through the back door, found Joe Moore's axe, covered the windows, then climbed the creaking stairs. He entered the parents' room first. Joe died instantly, never waking. Sarah might have stirred for a heartbeat before the axe found her. Little Paul never knew his parents were dying nearby. Room by room the killer moved. Herman and Boyd Catherine. Lena and Ina Stillinger. 8 murders in darkness and silence. Most died in their sleep, never knowing terror. But Lena's body position suggested possible movement. Perhaps she had one terrible moment of awareness before death claimed her. When the killing was done, the killer covered the faces, washed the blood from his hands, ate food in the kitchen, then disappeared into the June darkness, leaving 8 bodies and an unsolved mystery that haunts us still. More than a century has passed since that terrible June night in 1912. 8 lives were stolen, 8 futures erased, and justice was never served. The Villisca Axe murders remain one of America's most haunting unsolved cases. Despite years of investigation, multiple trials, and countless theories, we still don't know who killed the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters. Was it Reverend Lynn George Kelly, the mentally unstable minister who made cryptic confessions but was acquitted at trial? Was it William Mansfield, the violent son-in-law of Joe Moore's business rival? Was it an unknown serial killer who traveled by train, murdering families across the Midwest? Or was it someone else entirely, a suspect never seriously considered, a name lost to history? The questions remain unanswered, the evidence is contradictory, the witnesses are long dead. The killer, whoever he was, took his secret to the grave. The case changed America. It shattered the illusion of small-town safety, proving that horror could strike anywhere, that evil didn't respect boundaries or community trust. Doors that had never been locked suddenly needed bolts. Children who had roamed freely were kept close. The innocent trust of 1912 America died in that house on East 2nd Street. The Moore house still stands today, preserved as it was that terrible night, now a museum where visitors can tour the rooms where 8 people died. Some come seeking answers. Others come seeking thrills. The house has become a monument to unsolved mystery, to justice denied, to lives cut tragically short. We know that 8 innocent people, 6 of them children, were brutally murdered while they slept. We know they were killed by someone who planned carefully, who acted with terrible violence, who showed no mercy to children or adults. We know the killer escaped and was never definitively identified or brought to justice. We know that Joe and Sarah Moore were devoted parents building a good life for their family. We know Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul were children with futures full of possibility. We know Lena and Ina Stillinger were innocent guests in the wrong place at the wrong time. These 8 people deserve to live. They deserve to see another sunrise, to experience all that life offers, to grow old and fulfill their dreams. That chance was stolen from them by a killer whose name we may never know. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into one of history's most disturbing mysteries. The Villisca Axe murders remind us that some questions have no answers, that justice isn't always served, and that evil sometimes escapes punishment. If you found this case compelling, please leave a comment telling me your thoughts. Who do you think committed these murders? What theory makes the most sense to you? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime mysteries. Good night, rest well, and stay safe.